The Women's Self-Help Podcast is a place where women can go to find support, information, and tools they need to take control of their own health. We discuss the needs of women so you can become your own self-help guru. From how to manage your stress, eating for effective weight loss, real talk on self-image, maintaining lifelong health, and healthy aging, we cover it all. Be sure to visit womenssshh.com for more information on everything discussed in today's episode.
Welcome back to another episode of the Women's Self-Help Podcast. This is part 2 of our chat with Adrian De-Costa from iMove Physiotherapy here in Sydney. Today we're going to delve a little bit deeper into some other areas and some surrounding structures to the shoulder. We're going to start off today with talking about upper trap tightness. So, Adrian, can you just go through what are the causes of upper trap tightness?
Hey, Megan. So, upper trap tightness can be a few different things. You can see upper trap tightness, I guess, most commonly with work-based postures and I guess people being so sit down with their posture in front of a desk. You end up kind of having this real upper trap dominance, upper trap tightness. And then you add in, I guess, work and work stresses. And what we find is your really highly stressful individual ends up having that upper trap tightness present even further than, I guess, most people that are sitting down. So that's, I guess, the postural component of it.
So with people that are obviously, that was going to be my next question, that are really stressed, do they come in to see you in the clinics and they're kind of already got this permanent kind of shoulder shrug look happening before you even assess kind of an injury underlying it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a real shrugged up shoulder where they don't have a neck or they're just walking around without a neck like a turtle hiding in a shell. It's probably not that common, but it's something more so we see if they're sitting down. It's more so like a rolled forwards of the shoulders, and you can kind of, when you're observing the shoulders, you can see it's a little bit more tonic in the muscles, so a little bit more wound up, and then on feel and palpation, you can really see those muscles are quite, I guess the common word would be knotted up.
And so if someone feels like, if they come to you and they say, I'm feeling a bit knotted up in the back of my neck or my shoulders, they might, I suppose a lot of people might not be aware of exactly what movements they're actually doing that might be causing that tightness, or even the movements that the upper traps are responsible for. So how do you kind of go about explaining to them, where that tightness is coming from and what they might be doing that's actually causing the tightness?
Okay, I guess it really depends on the individual. So if we look at that posture-based individual, we could say is probably your work-based setup, and we'll talk a little about setup and that nature in terms of how their desk is set up, so a bit of like work-based ergonomics. Basically, the way the upper trap works is, I guess, the movement that most people consider with the upper traps is the shrugging movement, which is the elevation of the shoulder. But the upper traps also has a really important role to play when you're taking your shoulder up overhead as well. So it really helps to kind of control and initiate a lot of the rotation of the shoulder blade. So your shoulder and your shoulder blade kind of work together. It's a nice coupled movement. And as you're taking your hand to your side and overhead or forwards and overhead, that upper trap has a role to play. So I wouldn't say the upper traps is working when it shouldn't be. It's probably more so the over-engagement of the upper traps with most people that gets them in trouble.
So if you've got that over-engagement of the traps, then how does that actually change your biomechanics?
Yeah, so if you're going overhead, what we find with most people who are really upper trap dominant or compensate to use their upper traps, what you'll find is as they start to go overhead, so pretty much as their hands start to reach shoulder level, either forwards or to the side, they'll start to then hitch up the shoulder. And what that does is it starts to kind of change the orientation of how the shoulder blade and the shoulder bones, your scapula and your humerus, are working together. And in essence, it can start to really pinch up the shoulder and then in turn bring up pain. And most people might just feel like they're stuck or locked in terms of unable to go any further. But we know through the shoulder joint that you shouldn't really be locking up. It's a pretty free joint. It's a highly mobile joint, and it's just a change in mechanics that are causing that locking up of the shoulder rather.
So if someone's got that change in mechanics and their shoulder is locking up, is that when you see them start to get neck pain that is, or how do you kind of differentiate between the neck and maybe shoulder pain, whether it's from those areas specifically, or is it that upper trap tightness that results in the neck pain itself?
It's a great question. In the clinic, what the analogy that I use in the clinic is, I go, you're trying to find the egg or the chicken. And this is typically for the person that comes in maybe about a few months down the track, and they've got a pretty wound up neck, like their neck joints or their cervical spine, and then their shoulders quite wound up as well. So yeah, it's really hard to differentiate, because you can have a stiff neck causing tightness in the traps because your traps attaches onto your neck up the top. So you can imagine in protection, your body's going to want to lock up and protect. So you can have some really, really tough wound up traps. And because of that, that's going to have a downward reaction at the shoulder level. That's one way of looking at it, theoretically speaking. The other way of looking at it is you can have a really grumpy shoulder. Like we discussed last time, you might have a combination of maybe an impingement or a tendinopathy that's causing the upper traps to get really wound up or overworked because of compensation. And then as a result, because that upper trap attaches to the neck, you might find that, there's a bit of neck tightness and stiffness that you're starting to experience because of that initial shoulder issue. So I guess if it's someone early in the piece, we can kind of differentiate and say what might be the egg or the chicken. But if once it starts to kind of really develop, and most people, it's human nature that we put up with things. So most people will come in a few months down the track, and its pain is so complex by then that I don't really go into too much about, it's your neck or your shoulder, but really trying to address the deficits and trying to clean up the movement is where I'll go with it. I think if you try and explain the theory behind it, the theory doesn't always match up to what's happening in the human body. And that's where I guess our research as physios is we're finding that we need to do a lot more research on shoulder pain itself.
And so what would some of your red flags be for someone that's experiencing pain either in the upper traps or the neck or what they think is their shoulder? What's some red flags in terms of pain or movement kind of restriction that would make them want to come and see you?
Like a red flag in terms of something I might see in the clinic, so something that I'm more worried about than the typical shoulder, or something that a patient might feel that they should come in and see me for?
Something that a patient might feel. So if they, what's something that if they start getting pain, so for example, they start, they're doing a strength class here at KMJ and they start to lift the weight overhead, and on the first day they start to do that, they're getting like a sharp kind of twinging pain, and then it might go away, and then the next week they try again and it's a little bit better, but then the next day it's really, really bad. So would that be a red flag, or is there kind of, it depends on whether they're seeing you down the track or, so it's sort of, is there anything that when it comes to shoulder pain that is the first thing that sticks out?
Sure. So, the first thing I would say is when it's like a really light, dull, achy pain, it might be hard to differentiate whether it's an actual sort of pain within the shoulder that might need addressing, because you could imagine if you have a pretty solid workout, you're going to get a little bit more loading through the shoulder, and you get that kind of, I guess, what most people call the DOMS feeling, that delayed muscle feeling the next day, where the shoulder might be a little bit sore and achy, but that might settle down. What I would say is if you're really getting little sharp twinges here and there, like if you're lifting overhead in certain positions and you get a sharp twinge that might hit you at a certain point of movement, maybe just as you're taking it overhead or while you're overhead. If you're getting some sharp twinges, that's probably something you need to address early. Early intervention is always best. If you can start to work on that early and work on cueing the movement the right way, then you can really clean that movement up and keep yourself at training. Whereas if you persist with it, then it starts to become more of a constant pain with a lot of sharp twinges, and then that might knock you around from training, and then you might need some time off to let the shoulder settle down before you load it up again.
You touched on DOMS a little bit, or that idea of DOMS a bit there. How would you kind of describe to someone the difference between the feeling of that concept of DOMS when they finish the training session and, for example, where they could have possibly injured themselves and something they'd need to actually worry about?
Sure. So, with DOMS, you shouldn't be getting any sort of sharp bouts of pain. It should just be more so that in some ways a really fatigued dead arm feel where you try and move it overhead and you go, oh, geez, this is difficult. You feel like your a 1 or 2 kilo might be 1 or 2 kilo couple weight might be, a few kilos heavier than that. But it should be something you can still kind of manage to do. It's just more so you feel really fatigued and I guess that general soreness through that. But that should settle down in about a day or two. If you're training consistently and you're starting to get DOMS, that might happen as well. If you're having, I guess, a session that is a lot more higher intensity than your typical session. But it's hard to differentiate, I guess, the lower kind of achy points of pain where you might just feel a little bit sore, and that soreness might be kind of mixed up with a rotator cuff soreness. But if it's feeling more achy and throbby and you're getting this kind of referral of pain all the way maybe down to your elbow, that's probably more reminiscent of a shoulder pain than probably a DOMS feeling. A DOMS feeling is more generalized.
And so then is it more, other than generalized, a prolonged kind of pain as well? So, DOMS would be more characteristic in the initially straight after the session or maybe a couple of hours or even the next day after or 2 days that you've got that, like you said, more of a dull kind of aching sensation. But if it's prolonging for kind of, 7 days or more, that's when it could be something a little more sinister.
For sure. I think if it's not settling down in maybe 2 or 3 days, I think with research we can say it's about 42 to 78 hours is typically when your delayed muscle soreness feeling will settle down for most people. If it's not settling down in 2 to 3 days, and even if it's that 4th or 5th day, then that's probably more an indication of something happening within the shoulder in terms of maybe a tendon overload or some sort of reaction within the shoulder causing an irritation.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more now then about some more of the symptoms and connect it a little bit to our neck and the pain that can happen, where people often think, they've got neck pain or they've got a headache that is actually sometimes resultant from this upper trap tightness or the shoulder pain as well. So can you just talk a little bit about what you've seen with some of your patients with that connection between maybe neck pain and headaches that they might be getting?
Yeah, for sure. So if we look at possibly someone coming in with a rotator cuff tendinopathy and they've got this really wound up upper trap, the uppermost attachment of the upper trap attaches pretty much into the base of the skull right at the back. And then you can imagine if you've got this muscle that's really wound up, it starts to pull on all its attachments and you can get some headache-based symptoms. It's what we call a cervicogenic headache being the most common, where maybe you're turning to that side. So if it's your right shoulder, probably turning to the right, you can feel that kind of pinching up. And you get this headache that pretty much radiates through the back of the head, maybe onto the front a little bit, and more so caused with movement. So if there's movement of the head and neck, looking up, looking down, turning, that's starting to give you pain. And the headache tends to be really one-sided with it as well, where it just probably will stay on the right side if it's a right sore shoulder. It doesn't typically move on to the other side. And
so can you have sort of quote-unquote weak neck muscles?
In terms of an upper traps or in terms of other neck muscles?
In terms of upper traps and the connection there, so is it when the traps get tight, is that weakening kind of the scalene muscles at the back of the neck and at the base of the skull, that attachment point you just mentioned then, is that, causing what we call a weakness, or is that, a different relationship?
It's a different relationship. So what we're looking at, if it's a shoulder-related issue, it's probably more so the muscles being over-engaged. There might be a weakness in the trap, but the reason as to why the trap is really switched on and really tonic is because the muscle is just kind of blocking it in protection. And that's your body's way of trying to protect the joint, protect the shoulder, and protect the neck as well. But it's just more so that becomes an exaggerated process, or that kind of catastrophizes within your body, and it starts to then lock you up as you're trying to move around.
So with the neck muscles, then if someone's lifting weight overhead, so is it more a case, like you mentioned, of that sort of over-exaggeration or over-recruitment that's causing the pain rather than, quote unquote, being weak?
It might be one of the reasons. So you could have, I guess, the upper trap related pain because of the change in mechanics. So if you've got your upper traps causing a hitching pattern as you're trying to lift overhead, you could obviously, it's going to change the mechanics through the shoulder. If you've got a lot of hitching, you can create some sort of impingement with the shoulder like we discussed last time. So there might be a primary reason as to why you're maybe getting some impingement with the shoulder that's really presenting with a hitchy trap.
And if someone tends to hitch the traps up quite a lot, what is kind of some cues or tips that you give them to be either mindful of the fact that they're actually doing it or to actually be aware of how to change it?
It's a tricky one in terms of getting someone to cue it. You could work on cues for working on the shoulder blade, and there's a lot of schools that say, get your shoulder blade back and down and locking up the shoulder blade. But we know with research that you want a nice mobile shoulder blade. What I typically do is I will tend to offload a little bit and get the person stronger in a range where they don't hitch. And as they start to build up range, what you'll find is that hitch will start to dissipate because the trap's not as wound up. And as they're taking it overhead, they might have a little bit of a hitch, but they might not be hitching as much. And then you can start to work on a lot of scapular cueing and things of that nature. The other way you can go is doing some shrugging itself. So, which might almost seem counterintuitive, but because the muscle is tonic because it's just locked up, if you start to strengthen it up, you can start to get some changes where you're building some strength in the muscle, and it helps maybe in some ways neurally change what's going on. So just in terms of the nerves innervating the muscle. So you might be getting some changes there as well. So there's a couple of different approaches. I guess the main approach is you want to settle that shoulder down first. And I think I saw your social media post, and we kind of get this, we do this in the clinic as well. We deload, so we get it to settle down, and then we try and build up strength around the shoulder to get it moving better.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, because sometimes it is, I even notice with the ladies that come here at KMJ, the minute you drop the weight down, sometimes it's not a case of necessarily a weakness or even just the fact that they're hitching their shoulders up. It's just once you bring them past a certain weight or beyond their actual limit that they can do at that point in their training history, as soon as you take that load down slightly, then the hitching goes away.
Yeah, for sure. So if that's the case, then it probably is more indicative of the fact that, the rotator cuff or other muscles stabilizing the shoulder don't have enough strength in there. And that's probably why the upper traps feels the need to want to hitch up or work excessively hard. So yeah, when you drop the weights, everything is working and doing their job. And it just might mean getting stronger in that position for a little while longer before you increase the weights till that person has the capacity to lift heavier.
So we've talked a lot about the upper trap tightness is in relation to more of an athletic population or people that are regularly lifting weights. But what about if we talk about more of a general population? So we talk about, you mentioned before, your office workers in that ergonomic setup. So how can they kind of optimize their workspace so that they're reducing that upper trap tightness?
So typically, I think most workplaces these days, which is the awesome thing, have ergonomic offices, and they do a lot of these OH&S checks. But what I would ask most people is how is your screen set up? Is it in front of you? Are you looking straight at it? Are you looking down towards it? Or is it slightly above overhead and then you have to look upwards and elevate your neck upwards? So I'll ask the screen setup, and then I'll just kind of notice, I'll get some information, which is where is your keyboard? How far is your mouse? And then the other question I'll ask is, where is your phone? Do you use a headset or do you use the actual phone itself, like a phone line? So you could imagine if someone is coming in and they don't have a headset, but they're on the phone for maybe 25% of their day, and they're having to kind of almost hitch their shoulder to get to wedge the phone between their ear and their shoulder, they're going to have a really wound up trap and shoulder. So in that case, the solution might be pretty simple in terms of getting the workplace to look into getting a headset where they don't have to do that and they can pretty much control everything through the headset. If it's a keyboard mouse issue where they're really having to outstretch and it's not close to them, you want your keyboard and your mouse to be within arm's length, not greater than arm's length, or towards, 100% of arm's length. So that might be an issue of just bringing things a little bit closer. But in the greater picture, most people have a pretty decent ergonomic setup. The issue just ends up being, spending 8-9 hours in front of a computer. And unfortunately, as humans, we aren't designed to be that way. Maybe in about 50 years, once there's natural selection and adaptation, because so many of our ancestors, so maybe not 50 years, 100 years, because we've had a natural selection change of everyone being on computers and desks, we might end up having some really, really tough upper traps. But at the moment, because there's been this great shift in how much computers and stuff we use, it's mainly a volume-based thing. And for that person, I'll get them to just maybe take a 5 to 10 minute rest break every hour, get up, have a walk around, have a stretch or a yawn, go fill up your bottle of water. Just try and move around, because if you get out of your position and you reset yourself, you give your muscles a bit of time to switch off, you get moving, you get fluid, and then you can get back into that position. But if you're sitting down for 4 hours straight on the computer, losing track of time, then everything's going to just get wound up and fatigued, and you're going to find yourself in a pretty yucky posture.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't actually think about that. I've talked about on the KMJ blog a few times as well, and to our clients here, about the concept of fatigue resistance, and that also applies to your everyday job. Like if you're sitting for 8 hours a day or not in that ergonomic position that you just mentioned, then obviously that your body's fatiguing. It's under constant flexion or under constant extension, whatever position you've got it in all day, it's in that position for 8 hours. So it's going to get tired, it's going to get fatigued. So yeah, talking about the concept of training them to kind of be resistant as much as possible to that fatigue as well is also another important area.
Yeah, I think you need to have strategies. I think I haven't read any papers that have used exercise protocols to train someone to be better at sitting for 8 hours, because it's physically impossible. I mean, I'm pretty grateful in my job that I don't have to sit for 8 hours, but if I have to sit for 8 hours straight in front of a computer for an entire week, I'm going to start to complain about a lot of similar things that most people who come to me who are in that position will complain about. So, and that might be anyone, someone who's physically active, a personal trainer. If you get them to sit in front of a computer for 8 hours straight a day and do computer work as opposed to being out there exercising, moving around, they're going to complain about a lot of similar things as well. So it's more so being mindful of where you're at and trying to reset and move around. But if you're doing some good strength work, that's going to give you some sort of endurance through the day. So every time you reset yourself and you go back, then you can kind of get the body moving again. But I guess it's not something you can train someone to be, functionally strong and have the endurance for sitting for 8 hours. I think that's a task most professionals will go is just being silly and ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, that is. I mean, you can train your body to be strong in general to kind of withstand what you have to do. But yeah, not training it to do that as an ideal. I mean, we can't, like you say, we're not designed to sit down, and I find it very, very surprising if anyone actually even does to sit completely still for 8 hours a day is almost impossible, I think. We're at least fidgeting or moving around to some degree.
Yeah, and I mean, that's where the whole perfect posture model is probably getting a solid beating and being addressed, because, I mean, to have perfect posture, but what a skeleton shows us, and, with the theory behind it, it's impossible for someone to hold that for so long. I think I'll sit in front of a computer on my admin days, like today, my day off, and I think after 30 minutes, I just want to get up and move around, because I just feel like I'm literally curling over my laptop and falling onto it.
Yeah, I'm the same with you. I think for us as well, because we don't have to do that, luckily enough, that it's more of a struggle when we have to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think you just get up and move. It's not a deflection from probably where you're at, and most people don't want to hear get up and move if they're coming to a physio, but that's part of the solution. Getting stronger and moving better is going to help, but moving in general, if you're not moving, is going to play a big piece of the puzzle as well.
So when someone actually comes into the clinic, like presenting with a shoulder-based injury, what's your kind of thinking around their treatment process? So if someone comes in and they say to you, I've had this burning sensation in my shoulder, what are you thinking when you hear that?
Okay, so I mean, burning sensations could be a couple things. You could have a tendony burn. So if someone has come to me and typically with a history of I've taken my training up a little bit, I've really been lifting through, doing a lot of overhead lifting, shoulder movements, and it's been like that for the past couple of weeks, and now I feel like my shoulders I'm kind of getting this burny feel around my shoulder, kind of moving into my upper arm as far as my elbow a little bit. That could be more of a shoulder rotator cuff tendon-based irritation, because tendons hate rapid spikes in load, so you can get this kind of tendony burn. But then you also want to kind of make sure it's not a nervy-based burn as well. So nerve-based pain is typically that burning, pins and needles, tingling, numbness, that sort of pain. So we want to make sure that's nothing like that. So I'll typically ask them how it feels when they're sleeping. Are they getting burning pain when they're sleeping? And you can get both rotator cuff and nervy pain during sleep as well. And then you want to know how it's going, when they wake up in the morning. Is it better in the morning? Is it about the same? Does it change with movement? If it doesn't change with movement, it might be something a bit more nervy. So there's a couple of different things you want to differentiate between. Is it a nervy-based burn or is it a rotator cuff burn?
And so how do you then differentiate between those two? Is it always quite challenging? Does it depend on the activities the person's doing? How do you kind of go about differentiating those two?
Yeah, the history would typically give me a good clue as to what is going on. So like I said, if you have the person with the workout-based pain, sometimes if it's, burning not only in the shoulder, but the whole hand or part of the hand all the way down to the fingers, that might be more sort of a nerve-based pain, or burning with a bit of tingling and pins and needles sort of irritation might be more nervy. And if it's coming on with neck pain and neck movement, so if they're moving their neck and turning their neck and they're getting this sort of burning pain in their arm, that might be even an indication of a more nerve-based irritation. So we want to kind of screen through the entire arm and see what's going on.
And obviously when we talk about the shoulder, we're delving into shoulder injuries from all different areas here. We're going to talk now a little bit about the interaction of our back and when people get back pain, what that kind of means in terms of their shoulder and that interaction between the two. So when we talk about the thoracic spine, that incorporates the shoulder joint. So how would you explain the interaction between the shoulder and the back, if we start with that, in terms of the pain that people experience?
Okay, I think the easiest way to understand that is just by muscular attachment. So you have muscles like your rhomboids, your middle trap, your lower trap, all attaching at various points of your thoracic spine, so your mid-back. And they attach from your mid-back onto your shoulder blade. And they control movements of retracting your shoulder, rotating your shoulder downwards. So if you're someone who's active and you're moving around a bit more than normal, or you might not have the right movement pattern, you might start to over-engage these muscles in a certain way that might be starting to cause you back pain because of some sort of shock.